The Rise of the Steel God. Chapter 1. Forgotten Sands. The twin suns blazed mercilessly over the desolate landscape of Eridani 9, a backwater world long abandoned by the Empire. Cracked earth stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged rock formations and the rusted remnants of forgotten machinery. This was a world no one remembered, a world no one wanted, except those too desperate to leave. In the shadow of a crumbling refinery, a young man crouched behind a derelict supply crate, his breath shallow and heart pounding. Kain Vaynar, 17, but hardened by years of scraping by in the gutters of the slum town known as Black Hollow. His short black hair clung to his sweat-drenched forehead, and his sharp green eyes flickered with cautious determination. A single thought echoed in his mind: survive. The faint sound of footsteps crunched on the brittle ground nearby. Kain's fingers tightened around the handle of his rusted blaster pistol. He knew better than to hope they would pass him by. On Eridani 9, hunters were relentless, and today Kain was the prey. "Come out, boy," a gruff voice called, filled with cruel amusement. "You really thought you could steal from Garen Jace and walk away?" Kain gritted his teeth. He hadn't stolen much: a ration pack, a few credits, and a damaged data pad, but in Black Hollow that was enough to get you killed. Garen Jace's men didn't care why you stole. They only cared about sending a message. A shadow passed over him, and instinct kicked in. Kain rolled to the side as a bolt of red energy scorched the ground where he'd crouched moments before. He fired back blindly, buying himself time to scramble to his feet and sprint through the wreckage. "Get him!" the voice roared, and 3 men gave chase. Kain's breath burned in his chest as he weaved through the skeletal remains of ships that had long since been stripped for parts. His mind raced. Think, Kain. Think. But there were few places to hide in the open desert. A shot grazed his shoulder, and he stumbled, cursing under his breath. He ducked behind a rusted hull, gasping. Blood trickled down his arm, but he couldn't afford to stop. He checked his blaster. 2 shots left. Not enough. The men spread out, their footsteps drawing closer. Kain pressed his back to the metal, closing his eyes for a moment. His father's words echoed in his mind, words spoken long ago before the disease claimed him. "In a world like this, your mind is your sharpest weapon, Kain. Always outthink them." His eyes snapped open. Outthink them. He grabbed a small spherical device from his belt, a scavenged thermal detonator. It didn't work, not fully, but it still had power. Just enough to make them think it did. Kain peeked out, holding the device high. "You want me? Fine," he shouted. "But we're all going up together." There was a pause. "He's bluffing," one of the men muttered. "Maybe," Kain called back, taking a step forward. "But you really want to bet your life on that?" Another tense moment, then, "Damn it, fall back." The footsteps retreated, and Kain exhaled shakily. He waited until the sounds faded before lowering his arm. His fingers trembled, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't stay here. As night fell, the desert grew cold, the stars above stark reminders of the Empire that had long forgotten this place. Kain found shelter in a narrow canyon, lighting a small fire to keep the biting chill at bay. His wound throbbed, but he ignored it. He pulled out the damaged data pad, its screen flickering. Inside was a fragment of something he didn't fully understand. Coordinates. An old signal. A whisper of something hidden out there in the endless sands. Something the Empire left behind. Something valuable enough that Garen Jace wanted it. Kain's eyes hardened. He didn't have a choice. If he wanted to survive, he had to find it first. In the darkness, the young man stared at the flickering screen, determination burning brighter than the fire beside him. "Whatever it takes," he thought, "I will survive." Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The flickering glow of the datapad cast faint light across Kain's face as the desert night stretched on. His shoulder ached from the blaster wound, but the pain was familiar. Just another reminder that survival on Eridani 9 came with a price. The coordinates on the screen pulsed faintly, an ancient signal buried beneath layers of encrypted code. Whatever this was, it was valuable, and valuable meant dangerous. Kain sighed, leaning back against the canyon wall. His mind wandered to the past, to moments he tried hard to forget. His father, Rise of Kain, had once been a respected pilot for the Empire, before they discarded him like so much scrap. Disease had taken him, and the Empire hadn't spared a single credit for medicine. Kain's mother had died even earlier, leaving him alone in a world that had no mercy for orphans. No one's coming to save you, Kain thought bitterly, staring at the stars above. No one ever has. The crackle of gravel underfoot jolted him back to reality. Kain shot to his feet, blaster in hand, heart pounding in his chest. Relax, kid, a voice called out softly from the shadows. A figure emerged, hands raised in mock surrender. She was tall and lean, with short, messy brown hair and sharp amber eyes that gleamed with amusement. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have heard me coming. Kain didn't lower his blaster. Who the hell are you? The woman smirked. Name's Sira. I've been tracking that signal longer than you've been alive. And you? You're just the street rat who got lucky enough to stumble onto it. Kain narrowed his eyes. You working for Garen Jace? Sira chuckled dryly. Jace? Please. That slug doesn't have the brains to crack this signal, let alone find it. No, I work for myself. She tilted her head. Question is, are you smart enough to work with me? Or are you going to let Jace's goons shoot you in the back before you even get close? Kain hesitated. Trust wasn't something he could afford in this world, but Sira's confidence was unsettling. She didn't seem afraid of him, or anyone else for that matter. I don't trust you, he said bluntly. Good, Sira replied, crouching by the fire. You'd be a fool if you did. Kain stayed silent for a long moment. Finally, he sat down across from her, never taking his eyes off her. What's at the coordinates? Sira's smirk faded. Something old. Something the Empire left behind when they abandoned this rock. Tech, maybe weapons, maybe more. But whatever it is, it's powerful enough that they tried to bury it. Kain's eyes flicked back to the datapad. Why haven't you gone after it yet? Sira sighed. Because it's not that simple. The signal's fragmented. Your little datapad's got a piece of the puzzle, but we'll need more if we want to find the exact location. She leaned closer, her voice lowering. And trust me, kid, we're not the only ones looking. Kain's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. Mercenaries, scavengers, and worse. But what choice did he have? Running would only delay the inevitable. Fighting back? That meant finding whatever was out there first. Fine, Kain said quietly. But if you stab me in the back, you'll shoot me, Sira finished with a grin. Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried. The fire crackled softly between them, and in the cold desert night, an uneasy alliance was forged. Far in the distance, beyond the canyon walls, a faint red light blinked on a high ridge. Garen Jace's men had picked up the signal, and they were coming. Chapter 3, Blood and Dust. Kain felt the tension in his shoulders as dawn broke over the endless desert. The pale light painted the canyon walls in soft orange hues, but there was no comfort in the beauty. Not here. Not on Eridani 9. Sira paced nearby, checking her gear. Kain watched her carefully. She moved with the grace of someone who had seen too many fights and survived each one by sheer wit and skill. There was a predator's calm in her every movement. That alone made him wary. We need to move, she said, not bothering to glance at him. Jace's men will have traced that signal by now. We don't have time to sit around playing house. Kain sighed, pocketing the flickering datapad. His mind kept circling back to one thought. Why me? Of all the scavengers, mercenaries, and desperate souls on this forsaken rock, why was he the one who stumbled onto this lead? But the desert didn't care about questions, only survival. They moved through the canyon, sticking close to the shadows. Sira led the way, her keen eyes scanning the horizon. Kain followed, the weight of his blaster pressing against his side. So, Kain started, breaking the silence, how does someone like you end up here? Sira chuckled softly. Someone like me? What, you mean, not starving in the gutter like you? Kain scowled. Forget I asked. But Sira's tone softened. I was Imperial once, special recon unit, until the Empire decided this planet, and everyone on it, wasn't worth the effort. She shrugged. Turns out they didn't need us anymore. Kain raised an eyebrow. And you just stayed? Sira smirked. Not much choice. You don't walk away from the Empire clean. So I made a living scavenging and hunting. She shot him a glance. Better than dying quietly. Before Kain could reply, Syrah froze, holding up a hand. Kain stopped, heart pounding. She crouched low, pulling out a pair of old but functional macro binoculars. She scanned the distant ridge, her jaw tightening. "They're here," she whispered. Kain followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Garen Jace's men, at least 5 of them, were picking their way down the canyon wall. Their armor was mismatched and battered, but their weapons were sharp, deadly, and they weren't alone. Kain's breath caught. A hover bike sped through the canyon floor, kicking up dust. Garen Jace himself. "Great," Kain muttered. "The whole welcoming committee." Syrah grabbed his arm. "We can't fight them head on. We need a diversion." Kain glanced around. "There's an old fuel tank back there. If we can lure them close enough." Syrah grinned. "Not bad, kid." Minutes later, they were in position. Kain crouched behind cover, blaster ready. He aimed at the corroded tank, barely holding together under decades of rust. Syrah, perched on a ledge above, nodded. Jace's voice echoed through the canyon. "I know you're here, Vaynar. Hand over the datapad, and maybe I'll let you live." Kain's finger tightened on the trigger. "Liar," he muttered before firing. The tank exploded with a deafening roar, flames and shrapnel scattering through the canyon. The mercenaries dove for cover, caught off guard. Syrah opened fire from above, precise shots taking down 2 men before they could react. Kain darted forward, blasting another as he sprinted past. But Jace was already recovering, his hover bike roaring through the smoke. "Kain, move!" Syrah shouted. Too late. Jace fired, and Kain barely managed to dive behind a rock as a plasma bolt scorched the ground inches from his head. "End of the line, kid," Jace growled, dismounting with a cruel grin. But Kain wasn't ready to die. Not yet. He raised his blaster, steady despite the terror clawing at his chest, and he fired. Chapter 4. Beneath Twin Suns. The explosion had rattled Kain's bones, but it was the silence afterward that gnawed at him. He stayed crouched behind the jagged boulder, holding his breath as the smoke cleared. His fingers were still locked around his blaster, but his mind was elsewhere. Far from the fight, lost in the endless desert stretching beyond the canyon walls. A hand clamped on his shoulder and he flinched. "Relax," Syrah whispered, her voice low and steady. "We need to move before Jace regroups." Kain nodded, swallowing hard. His legs felt heavy as he pushed himself up, adrenaline draining from his body. They slipped away from the wreckage, weaving through narrow paths between the rocks until the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. Only when they reached a wide plateau did Kain stop, bending over to catch his breath. The twin suns were higher now, beating down on them without mercy. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, blinking against the harsh light. Syrah sat on a nearby rock, studying him with an unreadable expression. "First time running from someone who wants you dead?" Kain shot her a glare. "I've been running my whole life." "Sure," she replied dryly, "but there's a difference between running from street thugs and someone like Jace." "Guess I'm learning fast," Kain muttered. Syrah pulled out a small canteen, taking a measured sip before tossing it to him. "Good, because learning fast is the only way to survive here." Kain caught it, hesitated, then drank. The water was lukewarm and metallic, but it was the best thing he'd tasted in days. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly, lowering the canteen. "Survive, I mean. Alone." Syrah leaned back, eyes squinting against the sun. "You don't think about tomorrow. You don't think about yesterday. You focus on what's right in front of you. Every day's a gamble, kid. The trick is making sure the odds don't kill you." Kain stared at the cracked ground beneath his feet. "Doesn't sound like much of a life." "Yeah," she admitted, "but it's better than the alternative." A gust of hot wind whipped through the plateau, kicking up sand and dust. Kain's mind wandered, not to the fight they had just escaped, but to the distant echoes of home. Black Hollow wasn't much, just a collection of rundown shelters and rusting machinery, but it had been his world until now. He looked up. "Why do you care about this signal so much? There are easier ways to survive." Syrah's face hardened. "You really think I'm here for a quick payday?" Kain frowned. Aren't you? She let out a bitter laugh. Number whatever the Empire left behind, it's more than just credits. It's a way out. A way out, Kane echoed, confused. Out of this world. Out of this life. She stood, her eyes distant. I don't plan to die on this dustball. Kane felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Hope. Could that really be possible? Leaving Eridani 9 behind, escaping the endless cycle of violence and survival? He wanted to believe it, but hope was dangerous. He had learned that long ago. We need to find the next piece, Sierra said, pulling him back to reality. The coordinates on your datapad lead north, into the salt flats. It won't be easy. Kane sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It never is. They set off under the blazing suns, two unlikely allies driven by desperation. As they walked, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was bigger than both of them, and whatever they found out there in the wasteland, it would change everything. Chapter 5. Salt and Silence. The salt flats stretched before them like a vast, lifeless ocean, shimmering under the unforgiving heat of the twin suns. The ground crunched under Kane's boots, each step kicking up tiny clouds of white dust that clung to his clothes and skin. His throat was dry, and every muscle ached, but he pressed on. There was no choice. Sierra walked ahead, silent and focused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She moved like someone who had done this 100 times before, each step measured and precise. Kane, on the other hand, stumbled now and then, his body still adjusting to the endless expanse of nothingness. How much farther? Kane finally asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Sierra didn't turn around. Far enough. Kane sighed, half expecting that answer. You know, you could just say you don't know. I know, she replied with a smirk. Hours passed, the heat becoming unbearable. Kane's mind wandered as he trudged forward, memories bubbling to the surface despite his best efforts to keep them buried. He thought of his father, Yarrick, sitting by the window of their small shelter, staring out at the desert like it held some secret he could never quite grasp. There's always something out there, his father used to say, voice distant and wistful. You just have to be willing to find it. Kane had never understood what he meant, not until now. You're thinking too much, Sierra said suddenly, breaking the silence. Kane blinked, startled. How can you tell? You've got that look, she replied, the one people get when they're remembering things they'd rather forget. Yeah, well, there's a lot to forget. Sierra stopped, turning to face him. Let me guess. Dead parents, hard life, barely scraping by? Kane scowled. Something like that. Welcome to Eridani 9, she said flatly. No one here gets a happy story. Kane clenched his fists. Then why keep going? Sierra's expression softened, just for a moment. Because if we stop, we're already dead. Before Kane could respond, a distant sound echoed across the flats, a low mechanical hum, growing louder by the second. Sierra's eyes narrowed. Damn it! What? Kane asked, already feeling the tension in the air. Hover skiffs, she muttered. Jace's men. Kane's heart pounded. How did they find us? Sierra shook her head. Doesn't matter. We need to move. Now. They broke into a sprint, the salt crunching beneath their feet. Kane's lungs burned, but fear pushed him forward. He risked a glance back and saw two skiffs closing in fast, kicking up dust as they sped across the flats. We're not going to outrun them, he shouted. Sierra veered sharply to the right, heading toward a jagged outcropping of rocks in the distance. We're not trying to outrun them. We're trying to lose them. The skiffs fired, red bolts of energy sizzling past them. Kane ducked instinctively, adrenaline surging through his veins. They reached the rocks just as the skiffs circled around. Sierra pressed herself against a boulder, breathing hard. We can't stay here long. Kane's mind raced. They were cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned. But as his father's voice echoed in his mind once more, he realized something else. Your mind is your sharpest weapon, Kane. Always outthink them. His eyes scanned the rocky terrain, noting every crevice, every ledge. An idea began to form. Sierra, he whispered, I've got a plan. She raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Kain pointed to a narrow path winding through the rocks. We lead them in there. It's too tight for the skiffs, so they'll have to follow on foot. And then, Kain's lips curled into a faint smile. We make sure they regret it. Syrah chuckled softly. You've got guts, kid. Let's hope you've got brains, too. As the sound of approaching engines grew louder, Kain felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Chapter 6. Between the Rocks. The jagged rocks loomed around Kain and Syrah as they darted through the narrow path, the sound of engines growing louder behind them. Every sharp turn scraped at Kain's already bruised body, but he pushed forward, knowing that slowing down meant death. This plan of yours better be good, Syrah hissed, barely keeping pace beside him. It's not, Kain shot back, breathing hard. But it's all we've got. They reached a small clearing deep within the rocky maze. The sound of hover skiffs came to an abrupt halt, replaced by the distant shouts of men dismounting and preparing to give chase on foot. Kain crouched behind a large boulder, scanning their surroundings. The rocks formed a natural labyrinth, but it was also a dead end. They wouldn't last long if they didn't act fast. Syrah pulled out her blaster, checking its charge. So, what's the big plan, genius? Kain grabbed a handful of small, jagged stones, weighing them in his hand. We split up, lead them deeper in, make them think they've got us cornered. Syrah's eyebrows shot up. And then? Then, Kain said, a glint in his eyes, we make them chase ghosts until they're too tired or too lost to fight back. She smirked. Risky. I like it. Without another word, they split off in opposite directions, the crunch of their footsteps barely audible over the shouts of their pursuers. Kain kept low, weaving through the rocks, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Think, Kain. Outthink them. The first mercenary came into view, blaster raised. Kain froze for a heartbeat before hurling a stone against a distant rock wall. The sharp clatter echoed through the maze, drawing the mercenary's attention. He moved toward the sound, giving Kain the chance to slip past unnoticed. Kain's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't a fighter, never had been. Survival was his weapon, and right now that meant staying one step ahead. A sudden blaster shot rang out, followed by a muffled curse. Syrah, Kain thought, worry gnawing at him. But he knew better than to double back. She could handle herself. Probably. He led another mercenary on a wild chase, using every bit of cover the rocks provided. Sweat trickled down his face as he silently moved from one hiding spot to another. When he heard the man curse in frustration, Kain felt a small, grim satisfaction. Confusion was their ally. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. Kain barely had time to react before a mercenary shoved him against a rock wall, blaster aimed at his chest. Got you now, rat, the man sneered. Kain's mind raced. Think. Without warning, he kicked out, knocking the blaster aside just as it fired. The shot grazed the wall next to his head. Kain twisted free, grabbing a loose rock and smashing it into the mercenary's face. The man stumbled and Kain didn't wait. He ran. Moments later, he nearly collided with Syrah, who was grinning despite a bleeding cut on her forehead. Nice work, kid, she said breathlessly. I think we've got them chasing their tails. Yeah, Kain replied, equally winded. For now. They didn't stop moving until the shouts behind them faded completely. Finally, they reached the far edge of the rocky maze, where the salt flats stretched out once more. Syrah slumped against a rock, exhaling sharply. Well, that was fun. Kain leaned against another, hands on his knees. Remind me never to suggest another plan again. She chuckled. No promises. As the heat of the twin suns bore down on them, Kain's mind drifted to the coordinates on his datapad. This was just the beginning. Whatever they were searching for was still out there, buried in the sands of Eridani 9. And they weren't the only ones looking. Kain stared at the horizon, determination hardening his features. Survival wasn't enough anymore. He needed to win. Chapter 7, Fractured Horizons. The salt flats stretched endlessly before Kain and Syrah, shimmering under the relentless glare of the twin suns. Every step forward felt like a battle against the heat, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them both. But stopping wasn't an option, not when death followed so closely behind. Kain squinted into the horizon, his lips cracked and dry. How much farther do you think? Sierra, walking beside him, shielded her eyes with one hand. If I knew, I'd tell you. Kain smirked faintly. I'm starting to think you just enjoy watching me suffer. Sierra chuckled, though there was little humor in it. If I wanted that, I'd let Jace catch you. They fell into silence, the only sound the crunch of salt beneath their boots. Kain's mind drifted, the heat and exhaustion making it harder to stay focused. Every so often, he'd glance at the datapad, the flickering coordinates their only guide. He wondered, not for the first time, why he had to be the one to find it. Eridani 9 wasn't just a place you lived. It was a place that swallowed you whole if you let it. Black Hollow had taught him that much. The slums were filled with people who had given up, faces hollowed by hunger and hopelessness. Kain had always promised himself he wouldn't end up like them. But promises didn't mean much here. You're thinking too much again, Sierra said softly, not looking at him. Kain blinked, startled. How do you keep doing that? Years of surviving with no one to talk to, she replied. You learn to read people. Kain sighed, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. I don't even know why I'm doing this. Sierra stopped, turning to face him. You want to survive, don't you? Surviving and living aren't the same thing, Kain muttered. Sierra's gaze hardened. On this planet, they are. Kain met her eyes, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. Pain, loneliness, the kind of scars that didn't fade with time. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Before he could say anything, a sharp beeping from the datapad made them both freeze. Kain pulled it out, eyes widening. The signal. It's getting stronger. Sierra leaned in, scanning the screen. We're close. They picked up their pace, adrenaline cutting through their exhaustion. After another hour of walking, they crested a small ridge and stopped dead in their tracks. Below them, half buried in the salt flats, was what looked like the remains of an ancient facility. Rusted metal towers jutted out from the ground like broken bones, and scattered debris hinted at something far larger hidden beneath the surface. This is it, Sierra whispered. Kain felt a chill despite the heat. Looks abandoned. Places like this always do, Sierra muttered. They made their way down carefully, the air thick with tension. As they approached what appeared to be an entrance, a jagged hole in the ground, Kain felt his heart race. The datapad beeped faster. Sierra knelt beside the entrance, peering into the darkness below. No power, no lights. Could be dangerous. Kain smirked. Everything's dangerous. Fair point, Sierra muttered. With a deep breath, they descended into the darkness, leaving the harsh sunlight behind. The temperature dropped instantly, the air heavy with dust and memories of a forgotten past. Kain flicked on a small light attached to his belt, the beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with strange markings, faded from time, and remnants of old tech that even Sierra couldn't identify. What do you think this place was? Kain whispered. Sierra's eyes narrowed. Something the Empire wanted to forget. Kain's light landed on a rusted door, half open. He pushed it aside, revealing a large chamber beyond. At its center was a console, ancient but still humming faintly with power. Sierra's breath caught. That's not possible. Kain approached cautiously. The moment he touched the console, the room flickered to life, dim lights buzzing overhead. A holographic map appeared before him, glowing blue and green. It was a map of Eridani 9, but with places marked that Kain had never seen. This is what the Empire left behind, Sierra whispered in awe. Kain stared at the map, realization dawning on him. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Dark. The flickering holographic map hovered before Kain, casting a soft glow across the dust-covered chamber. His eyes traced the unfamiliar markings and strange coordinates scattered across Eridani 9, each one pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. This wasn't just a map. It was a blueprint to something far bigger than he had imagined. What is this place? Kain whispered, barely aware of his own voice. Sierra stood beside him, her amber eyes sharp and calculating. An imperial outpost, long abandoned, she replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. But this is more than just an outpost. Kain turned to her. You've seen places like this before? Not like this, she admitted. The Empire left a lot behind when they abandoned Eridani 9, but most of it was junk, scrap metal, broken tech. This question mark, this is different. Kane's fingers hovered over the console, tempted to explore further, but a part of him hesitated. Whatever this place held, it wasn't left behind by accident. You think the Empire's still watching? He asked quietly. Sierra's lips tightened into a thin line. Maybe, or maybe they just forgot. Either way, we need to be careful. Kane nodded, but his curiosity burned too brightly to ignore. He tapped a button on the console, and the map zoomed in, focusing on a particular section of the planet far to the north, an area marked only by a single word: vault. Sierra's eyes widened. A vault? On Eridani 9? Kane frowned. What's so special about a vault? She turned to him, her voice low. Vaults were where the Empire stored their most dangerous secrets. Weapons, technology, sometimes even people. If there's a vault here, it's not something they wanted anyone to find. Kane felt a shiver crawl down his spine. So, what do we do? Sierra crossed her arms, thinking. If we find it first, we might have leverage. Something valuable enough to buy our way off this planet. Kane stared at the map, conflicted. Survival had always been his goal, but now standing here in the forgotten remnants of the Empire's reach, he felt something else. Possibility. Suddenly the console flickered, and an automated voice crackled to life. Unauthorized access detected. Security protocol initiated. What? Kane stammered, stepping back. Sierra cursed under her breath. We need to move. Now! Before Kane could react, the chamber trembled as ancient mechanisms roared back to life. Metal shutters began to close over the exits, and the sound of grinding gears echoed through the halls. Go! Sierra shouted, grabbing Kane's arm. They sprinted toward the entrance, barely slipping through as the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. The ground rumbled beneath their feet as they emerged back into the harsh light of the salt flats. Breathing hard, Kane turned to Sierra. What the hell was that? Security, she replied grimly. Even after all these years, the Empire's ghosts still haunt this place. Kane glanced back at the sealed entrance. Whatever secrets the vault held, they weren't going to be easy to uncover. But one thing was clear, they weren't turning back now. As they trudged away from the outpost, Kane felt the weight of the journey ahead settle on his shoulders. Survival wasn't just about staying alive anymore. It was about finding the truth. Chapter 9. Whispers of the Vault. The salt flats stretched endlessly behind them as Kain and Sierra made their way through a narrow canyon, the heat of the twin suns pressing down on them with relentless intensity. The discovery of the vault weighed heavily on Kane's mind, the word echoing in his thoughts like a siren's call. He glanced at Sierra, who walked ahead in silence, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much since they left the outpost, and that made him uneasy. Okay, Kain finally broke the silence. What's your plan? Sierra didn't stop walking. Survive long enough to reach the vault. Improvise from there. Kain scoffed. Great. Real reassuring. She shot him a sideways glance. Welcome to Eridani 9, kid. Kane's lips tightened. You really think the vault has something worth all this? Sierra stopped abruptly, turning to face him. I know it does. The Empire wouldn't have built it otherwise. Her eyes, usually sharp with sarcasm, now burned with something else. Desperation. Kain recognized it because it mirrored what he felt inside. The need to escape, to break free from the weight of a life that promised nothing but dust and death. Why does it matter so much to you? Kain asked softly. Sierra's gaze hardened, but for a moment, Kain saw something crack beneath the surface. Because I wasn't always stuck here, she whispered, and I'm not dying on this planet. Kain wanted to press further, but the walls she built around herself were impenetrable. He knew that feeling all too well. They continued in silence, the only sound their footsteps crunching on the dry ground. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and purple, they found a small cave nestled in the canyon wall. It was barely enough to provide shelter, but it would do. Inside, Kain slumped against the rough stone, exhaustion washing over him. Sierra sat across from him, pulling out a small ration pack. She tossed one to Kain without a word. Thanks, he muttered, tearing into it. The bland, dry food was barely edible, but it was enough to keep him going. As they ate, Kane couldn't help but voice the question gnawing at him. What if we find the vault and it's nothing? Or worse, something we can't handle? Syrah smirked, though there was little humor in it. Then we die trying. Comforting, Kane muttered. She leaned back, staring at the cave ceiling. Look, kid, this world doesn't give second chances. Whatever's in that vault might be the only shot we have. I'm not wasting it. Kane nodded slowly. He understood that. Survival on Eridani 9 wasn't about hope. It was about taking whatever scraps the universe tossed your way and clinging to them with everything you had. As night settled in, the air grew cold, and Kane found himself staring at the flickering light of his data pad, the coordinates pulsing like a heartbeat. Tomorrow they would start their journey north into the unknown. But for now, in the quiet of the cave, Kane allowed himself a rare moment of rest. In the darkness, only one thought remained. Survive, no matter what. Chapter 10. The Long Road North. The first light of dawn crept over the canyon walls as Kane adjusted the straps of his worn pack. The cool morning air would vanish soon, replaced by the scorching heat of the twin suns, and every second counted. Syrah stood nearby, securing her gear with practiced efficiency. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of the journey ahead hung between them. We stick to the canyons for as long as we can, Syrah finally said, breaking the silence. Less chance of being spotted. Kane nodded. And if Jace's men are waiting for us? Syrah smirked faintly. Then we make them regret it. They set off, their footsteps muffled by the soft dust of the canyon floor. Kane's mind drifted as they walked, the monotony of the landscape blending with his own restless thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step brought them closer, not just to the vault, but to something far more dangerous. Hours passed, the heat intensifying with each minute. Kane's clothes clung to his skin, soaked in sweat, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. He glanced at Syrah, who marched forward without complaint, her face set in a determined scowl. How does she do it? He wondered. Ever been this far north? Kane asked, more to distract himself from the heat than genuine curiosity. Syrah shook her head. No one goes this far. Too dangerous. Too many stories. Stories? Kane pressed. Legends, really, Syrah replied, her tone dismissive. People talk about things out here. Creatures, traps left by the Empire. Maybe even worse. Kane frowned. You don't believe in any of that? I believe in surviving, she shot back. Everything else is just noise. They walked in silence again, but Kane's thoughts clung to her words. The unknown had always terrified him more than anything else. Life in Black Hollow had been brutal, but at least he knew what to expect. Out here, there were no rules. By midday, they found themselves in an open stretch of desert, the canyon walls shrinking into distant ridges. The heat was unbearable, each step more agonizing than the last. Kane's mouth was dry, and his legs felt like lead. We need to find water, Kane muttered, his voice hoarse. Syrah nodded. There's a chance we'll find a spring near the ridge ahead. Kane followed her lead, though doubt gnawed at him. The desert didn't care about their needs. As they reached the ridge, Kane's heart sank. Nothing but cracked earth and lifeless stone stretched before them. No water, no shelter. Great, Kane muttered bitterly. What now? Syrah scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowing. There. Kane followed her gaze and spotted a faint shimmer in the distance. A mirage? Or something more? Worth a shot, Syrah said, already moving. As they approached, the shimmer solidified into a cluster of jagged rocks, and within them, a small pool of water gleamed under the harsh sunlight. Relief washed over Kain as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees and scooping water into his mouth without care for its cleanliness. Syrah knelt beside him, filling their canteens in silence. But as Kain drank, a sudden realization hit him. The pool was too exposed, too obvious. We're sitting targets here, he whispered. Syrah nodded grimly. I know. Before they could move, a voice echoed from the ridge behind them. Looks like we found our rats. Kane's blood ran cold. Garen Jace's men. They had walked right into a trap. Chapter 11. Dust and Deception. Kain's heart pounded as he turned to see three of Jace's mercenaries standing atop the ridge, their weapons trained on him and Sira. The desert wind kicked up small clouds of dust, swirling around them like a cruel reminder of their predicament. "Thought you could slip away, huh?" One of the mercenaries sneered, a scar cutting across his jaw. "Jace will be real happy to see you." Kain's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed. His blaster was within reach, but any sudden movement would mean certain death. Sira crouched beside him, kept her expression calm, but Kain could see her eyes darting, calculating. She was looking for a way out. "Think, Kain," he told himself. "Outthink them." The mercenaries began to descend the ridge slowly, confident in their advantage. One of them chuckled darkly. "Hand over the data pad, and maybe we won't shoot you where you stand." Kain's grip tightened around the data pad in his pack. He couldn't let them take it. "Not now," Sira whispered without turning her head. "I'll take the two on the left. You handle the one on the right." Kain blinked. "Are you serious?" "Deadly," she replied softly. Before Kain could protest, Sira moved like lightning. She dove to the side, drawing her blaster in one fluid motion and firing a shot that grazed the lead mercenary's arm. Chaos erupted. Kain, adrenaline surging, grabbed his blaster and fired at the mercenary on the right. The shot missed, but it was enough to make the man hesitate. Kain scrambled behind a rock as blaster bolts scorched the ground around him. "Sira!" Kain shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Keep moving!" she yelled back, firing another shot that forced the mercenaries to duck for cover. Kain's breath came in short gasps. He was no soldier, no trained killer. But survival was something he knew well. He darted from cover to cover, firing blindly to keep their attackers off balance. Sira's shots were more precise, picking off one mercenary with a clean hit to the chest. Two left. The scarred mercenary growled in frustration. "You little rats are dead!" Kain's mind raced. The pool of water, the ridge. "Use what's around you," his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Survival is about adaptation." Suddenly, an idea struck him. Kain holstered his blaster and grabbed a small detonator from his pack, one of the few tools he had managed to salvage over the years. It was old, barely functional, but it might be enough. "Sira!" he shouted. "Cover me!" Without waiting for a response, Kain sprinted toward the pool of water, sliding behind a jagged rock. He activated the detonator, its faint hum barely audible, and threw it into the water. The mercenaries laughed. "Missed, kid!" Kain smirked, pressing a button on his datapad. "Did I?" The detonator sparked, reacting with the mineral-rich water. An explosion erupted, sending a cloud of steam and debris into the air, momentarily blinding their attackers. Sira didn't waste the opportunity. She fired two precise shots, taking down the remaining mercenaries before the dust settled. Kain exhaled shakily, his heart still racing. That was close. Sira holstered her blaster, giving him a rare, approving nod. "Not bad, kid." Kain chuckled nervously. "I'll take that as a compliment." They quickly gathered supplies from the fallen mercenaries, knowing more would come soon. As they prepared to move out, Kain couldn't shake the feeling that every encounter brought them closer to something far bigger than either of them realized. The vault was waiting, and so was everything it promised. Chapter 13. The Approach. The air was thick with dust as Kain and Sira trekked through the winding paths of the desert. The twin suns, now beginning their descent, cast long shadows across the cracked earth, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The heat had finally started to recede, but the oppressive silence that followed them was worse. Kain adjusted the straps on his pack, the weight of the journey pressing down on his shoulders. He'd never felt this tired. Every muscle ached, every step seemed harder than the last. But there was no turning back now. The coordinates were close, closer than he had ever been to anything that might change his life, or destroy it. Sira moved ahead as resolute as ever, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Her silence was heavy, and Kain knew better than to ask questions now. She was like a stone, unyielding and unbreakable. But he could see the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. Her shoulders were tense, her movements sharp, like someone who had spent too long looking over their shoulder. "How long until we reach the vault?" Kain asked, breaking the quiet. Sierra didn't look back. Tomorrow, if we push hard enough. Tomorrow, Kain repeated, the words settling in his chest. What do you think we'll find? Sierra paused, her voice low. Whatever's in there, it's not going to be easy to get. The Empire didn't build vaults like this for anyone to waltz in and take whatever they wanted. The fact that it's been hidden for so long means it's dangerous. Whatever it is, it's valuable. Or deadly. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Kain found his mind racing. Dangerous. Valuable. Deadly. These were the kinds of things the Empire hid away. Things that could destroy lives, or change them. They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the dry earth. But as the evening sky began to darken, Kain's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were being watched. Sierra, he said, his voice barely a whisper, do you feel that? Like, we're not alone out here? She stopped abruptly, her posture stiffening. She looked back at him with sharp, assessing eyes. You think someone's following us? I don't know, Kain replied, his pulse quickening. It just feels off, like we're being watched. Sierra's gaze flickered across the barren landscape. Stay alert and keep moving. If someone's tailing us, they'll show themselves soon enough. The tension between them was palpable as they pushed forward, now even more cautious in their movements. The air seemed to grow heavier, and every rustle of wind felt like the prelude to something dangerous. As they neared a cluster of craggy rocks, Kain heard a faint sound, a soft metallic click, barely audible above the wind. His heart skipped a beat. Sierra, he hissed, dropping to a crouch. Sierra didn't hesitate. She immediately darted behind the nearest boulder, pulling Kain with her. They waited, breath held, as the sound grew louder, closer. A figure emerged from behind the rocks in the distance. A lone scavenger, armed with a blaster and dressed in rags, moving cautiously but with purpose. Just one, Kain muttered, his hand inching toward his weapon. Not just one, Sierra whispered back, her eyes narrowing. He's not alone. As if on cue, two more figures emerged, flanking the scavenger. They were dressed similarly, ragged clothes and weapons in hand. They were too coordinated to be simple wanderers, too deliberate in their movements. Sierra's instincts flared, and Kain's unease deepened. They've been following us, Sierra said grimly, and now they think they've got us. Kain glanced at her, his mind racing. What do we do? Sierra's eyes flicked to the surrounding rocks. We don't let them get any closer. If they know what's good for them, they won't try to take us alive. Without waiting for a response, she rose swiftly from her crouch, moving like a shadow across the desert floor, her blaster raised and steady. Kain followed, staying close, his own blaster drawn. The three figures hadn't seen them yet. Sierra took the first shot, her aim true. The lead scavenger dropped to the ground, his blaster clattering uselessly against the rocks. The two others immediately scattered, diving behind cover. Kain's heart pounded as he darted into position, firing at one of the figures. The shot was off, missing by inches, but it was enough to force the second scavenger to take cover behind a large boulder. The third figure fired back, a blaster bolt just missing Kain's shoulder. The heat from the blast singed his jacket, and his pulse quickened. He was no soldier, but instinct kicked in, and he returned fire, the shot grazing the scavenger's arm. Sierra was already on the move, her eyes locked on the remaining threat. She closed the distance quickly, using the rocks as cover, and within seconds the final scavenger was disarmed, lying flat against the desert floor. Kain exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. He glanced at Sierra, who stood over the unconscious scavenger, her face unreadable. They weren't just following us, Kain said, breathing heavily. They were trying to get rid of us. Sierra nodded, her expression hard. People don't survive out here by being kind. They survive by eliminating threats before they become one. Kain couldn't help but wonder if that was what they had become, threats to someone else's future. But that thought was swallowed up by the harsher truth. The vault was close, and no matter what it held, it was their only way out. Chapter 14. Into the Abyss. The sun was now low in the sky, casting long shadows over the desert as Kain and Sierra moved forward. The tension between them had only grown since the skirmish with the scavengers. Kain couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them just beyond the next ridge. "We're close," Sierra said, her voice taut with the same sense of urgency that Kain felt. "Tomorrow we'll reach the vault. If we're lucky, we'll have the element of surprise on our side." Kain didn't respond immediately. He was too distracted by the uneasy knot in his stomach. The world around them seemed to grow more oppressive with every step. The wind howled, kicking up waves of dust that stung his face, but his mind was elsewhere, on the vault, on the uncertainty of what they would find. "You've been quiet," Sierra added, glancing back at him. "You still thinking about those scavengers?" Kain shook his head, though he couldn't quite shake the memory of the desperation in their eyes. "No, I just—" He stopped himself, unsure of what to say. The truth was, he was starting to wonder if they were walking into something much bigger than either of them had prepared for. Sierra's eyes narrowed as she slowed her pace. "What?" Kain hesitated, then spoke, his voice quiet. "What if it's all a trap? What if the vault isn't just valuable, but dangerous enough that the Empire had to bury it out here and hide it from the world? What if we're not meant to survive?" Sierra didn't stop walking, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of something far too close to fear. "You're thinking too much again," she muttered. "We don't have the luxury of doubt. You think the Empire didn't know exactly what they were doing when they built that vault? They knew it would be dangerous. They knew people would die trying to find it. But that doesn't change the fact that it's our only chance." Kain didn't argue. She was right. Survival wasn't about thinking too much. It was about acting. And right now, acting meant moving forward. They reached the crest of a rocky outcrop just before the sun dipped completely beneath the horizon. The night was coming fast, and with it, the cold that would make everything feel even more hostile. Kain glanced down into the valley below them. It was then that he saw it. The structure. The vault. It lay hidden among the jagged rocks and ravines, partially covered by a sprawling network of old, half-destroyed machinery. The place seemed abandoned, but Kain's instinct screamed at him not to trust his eyes. The Empire hadn't left anything this important without layers of protection, and now that they were so close, the weight of the unknown pressed down harder on his chest. Sierra followed his gaze, her lips curling into a thin line. "It's too quiet," she muttered. "We're not the only ones who found it." Kain's heart skipped a beat. She was right. There was something off about the place. It didn't feel like an ancient ruin. It felt like a trap. The wind had stopped entirely, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. "We need to rest," Sierra said, her tone suddenly more serious. "We can't rush this. We don't know what's down there." Kain nodded, though the words didn't reassure him. He knew she was right. They needed to be careful. This was no longer just about finding the vault. It was about surviving what waited for them inside. They found shelter for the night in a small cave along the ridge, setting up a fire with the little kindling they could find. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the dark, and Kain couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. "You still think we're walking into a trap?" Sierra asked, sitting across from him, her gaze fixed on the fire. Kain shrugged, trying to appear casual, though he knew Sierra wasn't fooled. "Maybe, but it's our only shot. If we don't make it out, at least we'll know what we were up against." Sierra studied him for a long moment. Then with a heavy sigh, she looked away. "I don't know if we'll make it out, but I'm not going back without answers. Not after everything." Kain didn't have an answer for that. He understood the need for answers. He'd spent his whole life searching for a way out of the world that had trapped him. But now he wasn't sure if the truth would be enough to set him free. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the cave. Kain's thoughts drifted back to the vault. Whatever the Empire had hidden there, it was waiting. And now it was their turn to find out what secrets it held. But deep down, Kain couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a treasure hunt. This wasn't about surviving Eridani 9 anymore. This was about uncovering something far darker, something that might not just change their lives, but the entire fate of the planet. As the cold of the desert night crept in, Kain lay back, trying to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He couldn't stop thinking about what waited below, and whether they would make it out alive to see it. Chapter 15. The Vault's Secret. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Kain and Sirah reached the edge of the valley. The vault loomed before them, ancient and seemingly forgotten. The weight of the journey pressed down on them both, but neither of them said anything. The closer they got, the more the air around the vault felt suffocating, heavy with something ancient, something malevolent. "Ready?" Sirah asked, though her voice was sharp with tension. Kain didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the dark doorway before them, the entrance sealed shut by the same intricate mechanism that had kept it hidden for so long. The door was covered in strange symbols, markings of a language far older than anything the Empire had ever used.